Everybody, welcome back to the channel and to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be going over rate of force development, or RFD, abbreviated or for short, and an introduction to the impact that RFD has on sport, a little bit of the physiology behind it, and ways that we can look to implement it into a program to help us be stronger in the gym, be better at sport, and to help us prepare more physically. Let's get right into it. So what is the rate of force development? So there's a lot of different ways that we can calculate different processes, but one way that, and muscle contractions, right? But one way that we can describe the rate of force development is the speed at which a muscle can generate force. So if you think about like Olympic weightlifting and all those fast explosive movements, we're typically looking at power, right? Power being energy over time. Now we can apply that a little bit more laterally to rate of force development. Force development being force over time, or newtons being mass times acceleration. We can apply energy over time to force over time. So generally what you'll see is those who have a higher rate of force development are able to produce more force in less time, typically may do better in sporting activities due to the speed at which they can generate that high level of force. So there's a lot of different classifications, theories, and methods to explain force production and muscle contraction, but here's just a very non-conclusive list of a few that I'm going to be using for this video. So action potential. So action potential, one way to describe it is the rapid electrical transmission or signal produced by the nervous system to help enable the movement of different ions, right? So if you look at like the periodic table of element in chemistry, you have a whole bunch of different elements. Well, particularly from muscle, from what I can recall, we're looking at a lot of like calcium, potassium, and sodium ions. For the case of this video, we're going to be talking about rate of force development, broadly speaking, the contraction of muscle, and diving a little bit more into why the movement of ions is important. So, action potential, movement of the ions due to electrical transmission. Rate coding. The rate at which motor units create these action potentials. So the rate at which these signals are sent from the spinal cord to that muscle. So a higher firing rate may lead to more frequent, stronger, and faster muscular contractions. So the rate at which we're able to send those action potentials down to the muscle, the more frequent, stronger, and faster muscular contractions that we can have. Next up, we're going to be diving a little bit more into motor unit recruitment, or the Hyndman size principle. So this is one way to describe the order at which motor units are activated to help facilitate contraction when looking at moving smaller or larger objects. So typically what you'll see is smaller muscles, like think about the muscles in your eye, or think about the muscles in your hand to help facilitate a little bit more fine motor control. Those muscles tend to be activated a little bit more quickly, as opposed to our larger motor unit recruitment muscles, like our gross muscle contractions. So think about like your hips, like moving your hips around, trying to squat, stand up, or trying to run. A lot of those muscles, those gross muscle contractions, require larger motor unit recruitments and may be recruited at a later time frame compared to the smaller and finer movements. Lastly, what we're going to be touching on a little bit is muscle pennation angle. Now, this can be described as the angle at which muscle fibers attach to a tendon relative to the line of action. So if you think about like a tendon here and you have a muscle belly going out, muscle pennation angle could be the angle at which those fibers attach to the tendon relative to the line of action. So here to here, this could be like your muscle pennation angle. So these are just two diagrams I decided to put in here. I'm going to be diving a little bit more into it now. So on the left-hand side, you'll have a graph here. On our y-axis, we have the relative tension. This could just be the tension going into the muscle. And then on the x-axis, we have time in milliseconds, right? So what you'll see here is you will see a twitch, unfused, and fused tetanus. Twitch being, we have those action potentials, right? And they're being sent down to the muscle. What you'll see is that we have action potential here, and more action potentials being sent down to the muscle in kind of these like wave patterns, right? If we're able to summate those waves more rapidly, we might get into what we call like wave summation and fused tetanus. So we have a summation of waves and then fused tetanus going out to all the way to the top here. So typically what you'll see is as the muscle duration or as the duration of time, increases, we may require more and more action potentials to get a fused tetanus. And fused tetanus can just, like, if you want to think about it this way, if you want to move like a heavy box, we need a lot of action potentials to recruit those higher motor unit muscles in order to move that heavy object, right? So basically, action potentials, wave summation into fused tetanus, a lot of action potentials to recruit bigger muscles to move something heavy. And if we can start to decrease that time, we might get into different adaptations within the muscle. And I'll be diving into that later. Next up, we have a contraction synapse. So what we see here is we see an action potential being sent down from the nervous system. And just to kind of simplify this whole thing, action potential being sent down from the nervous system going into the muscle cell. We have a whole bunch of different movement of ions to help us contract a muscle, right? So action potential, electrical signal, movement of ions going into the muscle cell to help move a whole bunch of different ions within the muscle and help you contract your muscle. So why are these important, right? There's a whole lot of talk about ions, action potentials and muscular strength and all that kind of stuff. Why is all this important? So when we're looking and considering force production, it's important to recognize how quickly we can generate force, not only to reduce our risk of injury, but also to recognize the trainable qualities that we can adapt to within the gym or within any kind of strength training, right? So we can look at this with the size principle, right? When we look at trying to move larger objects, we're going to need to recruit higher threshold motor units in order to move that object. So if you want to correlate those two things together, the size principle, moving higher objects is going to require more higher threshold motor units and bigger muscle. Rate of force development, trying to generate that force rather quickly. If we want to correlate those together, we can start thinking about it this way. If we're able to generate the adaptations required to recruit those bigger muscles, right, and produce higher force in less time, we're able to reduce our risk of injury. And we're also able to, like we mentioned before, tolerate forces within less time and higher amounts and higher magnitudes of those forces to be better at sport and any other physical endeavor we're looking to achieve. So now, what are some factors that can affect rate of force development, right? A lot of different things going on here. What are some things that may affect it? So to just kind of go over these pictures here, we have a cell, broadly speaking, and that would help carry those action potentials. We have the muscle with the pennation angle, and then we have the muscle fiber type. So there's several different factors that go into what affects this. But however, for this video, we're just going to be touching on these factors broadly speaking. So when we look at the cell and action potential, cells, amongst a whole different vast majority of different aspects that go into that, we have dendrites. If you follow my cursor, we have dendrites that help kind of transmit signal from cell to cell. We have the cell body, the nucleus, the axon, the myelin sheath, not pictures like the nodes of non-Vier, but then we also have axon terminals. So typically what happens is the nervous system will send a signal, that impulse travels throughout the cell and into the muscle. Now, if the myelin sheath and the nodes of non-Vier are deteriorated or reduced in any way, this may slow the signal and reduce it in any form of capacity. In this video, I'm not going to be diving into the biological ways that does happen, because that is beyond my knowledge and beyond what is required for this, what I'm trying to explain in this video. But just broadly speaking, if we reduce the sheath and the nodes of non-Vier, that may reduce the speed at which those action potentials get transmitted and help contract muscle. So next up, we have muscle pennation angle and physiological cross-sectional area. So it sounds like a mouthful. Essentially, if you follow my cursor, what we'll have here is a muscle, a bipedal muscle, which means that like the fibers are arranged in like this oblique pattern. We have the tendon going through, and then we also have the muscle belly going wrapped around, and then we have the fibers going out obliquely, right? So we have force. If the muscle is going to contract to produce force, less force is going to go through that tendon because it's a little more perpendicular to the tendon. However, as you can see, demonstrated by alpha here, what we'll see is that we have a larger angle relative to the tendon. What that means is we're able to pack a little bit more muscle fibers into that muscle cell or the body there. So why is this why is this important? So if you see, if you have like pennant, bipennant, or like multi-pennant muscles, there's going to be different angles at which those fibers are oriented to the muscle, like the tendon. So there may be less force that's transferred to that tendon. However, or it becomes a little bit more perpendicular in some form or fashion. If you look at like fusiform muscles, oftentimes like your biceps, those those muscle fascicles are arranged in a little bit more of like a longitudinal or a parallel pattern relative to the tendon. So more of that force may be put into the tendon as well. So we're just looking at different angles at which those fibers are oriented relative to the tendon. And the higher the pennation angle, there may be more volume of muscle fascicles that can be put into that muscle belly. Well, I know. And then next up, we have just some examples. So like I talked about before, we have like our bipennant muscles. We have the tendon here, the belly going out, and then we have like an oblique feather-like projection of those muscle cells. So, or the muscle fascicles. But what you'll see is where you may be able to put in more of those like feather-like projections or more of those muscle fascicles into that belly. We may be, and since there's more muscle in there, we may be able to generate more force. So bipennant muscles, you may see more so in like our quadriceps or our deltoids. Those, like I said, those fibers are arranged a little bit more obliquely. We're able to pack a little bit more fascicles into that muscle. As opposed to like a fusiform muscle, we may see that in our biceps brachii, or even like in our sartorius muscle. What the heck is a sartorius? So sartorius is another muscle that's attached to like the hip and the knee, and it kind of runs on like this S form relative to the thigh and the hip. So it kind of runs like this way. So it attaches kind of from like the top of the hip there all the way to the far end of like our femur or thigh bone, right? But that muscle is typically arranged, the fibers are typically arranged in like this fusiform pattern, so they follow a little bit more of a parallel orientation relative to the tendon. So there's a lot of things that are going on here with regards to the pennation angle and the rate of force and muscle contraction. What I read though was it was like, okay, if we have a higher pennation angle and we're able to pack more force into, if we're able to pack more muscle fibers into that, why is the force output to the tendon lower, right? If we look at like a fusiform muscle, right, they're a little bit more parallel to the tendon, so therefore it would make sense that more force be put into the tendon. So what I decided to do, I decided to look into a little bit more research that went into the pennation angle and the rate of force development. Because if we're able to generate more force quickly and generate higher levels of force, we want to consider the orientation of those fascicles relative to the muscle. So what I found was in the study, and I'll link and the studies are linked in the references on this PowerPoint. But what I found was that there was a moderate positive correlation between a resting pennation angle and rate of force development during an isometric contraction. So if we compare like a isometric to a dynamic contraction, isometric being where the fascicles aren't necessarily changing length a lot, but dynamic contraction where they are. In this study, there was actually a stronger correlation between the dynamic versus the isometric contraction. So what does this mean? So particularly in pennate muscles where the fibers are arranged a little bit more obliquely, right? Higher pennation angles may increase what we call a gear ratio. So I was a little bit confused. I was like, what are gear ratios? So gear ratios are a way of describing like the mechanical orientation of the muscle fibers relative to the tendon as we are changing the length of the muscle. So if we're able to increase the ratio of these gear ratios relative to the muscle, like the orientations relative to the tendon, if we're able to shorten them at any capacity, we may be able to produce better force at a more advantageous velocity to produce that force. So that sounds like a lot, right? So all I'm trying to say there is there may be certain angles at which the muscle is oriented to produce a little bit more advantageous velocity, like during a dynamic contraction, to produce a higher and more efficient force output. One limitation that I did find was that there was only about 22 participants in the study. But as with much research, there's going to be limitations because we can't control for every variable. However, it's interesting to know how pennation angles may have an impact on the rate of force development, particularly in monitoring those joint angles. So like when we look at isometric versus dynamic, the joint angles are constantly changing, and the different contraction types. So obviously, I have a lot to learn with this too, but this is just something interesting that I found. Now, another study that I looked at was the muscle architecture and its behavior regarding the pennation angles and rate of force development. So just another article. So as we increase the cross-sectional area, there's going to be a higher load or higher rate, or excuse me, an increase in absolute forces. What this study found was that the forces tended to be found from the muscle in later phases of a contraction. So what does that mean? In this study, that they divided the phase of contraction into earlier and later phases. So in the earlier phase, this phase was predominantly dominated by neural factors. So think about like the action potentials and motor unit recruitment, and less by the architecture of the muscle, right? So when we're changing muscle length, right, the pennation angle has less time to shorten in the earlier phases of contraction, a little bit more of those neural aspects. But during the later phases of a contraction, particularly between like the 75 to 200 millisecond range, this phase was further influenced by muscle tendon properties and that cross-sectional area and the pennation angle during a contraction to optimize the shortening, right? So if we take like the physiological cross-section or the PCSA, right, and we're able to change the pennation angle relative to like the contractions that we're performing in the gym, obviously depends on the muscle and everything and the different pennation angles. But if we're able to see how the muscle shortens and contract during contractions, there may be more of an influence on the forces being produced by the nervous system and the muscle within the muscle at a later phase. In the earlier phases, it may come down a little bit. It typically comes down to more of the neural factors. So a lot of different words there. Basically, to sum up what this article said was earlier phases may be more influenced by neural factors, and then later phases may be more influenced by muscular architectural factors or muscle properties. So continuing on with this, basically, it's what I was just describing. There is at an earlier phase, neural factors are going to be more influenced, and then muscle properties, the cross-sectional area, and how that pennation angle may change. That's going to be more in the later phase of a contraction, just due to the shortening and the lengthening that goes on within the muscle. And I honestly did not know about this, right? So I thought this was pretty cool. I didn't know about this until I looked it up a little bit more and took a little bit of a dive into it. But I thought this was interesting to see how the pennation angle may influence rate of force development. So next up, what we have is the muscle fiber types. So there are three general types of muscle fibers. There's type 1, where there's a slow twitch, where it's a little bit more oxidative based. So if we go all the way back, right, I'm talking predominantly right around these muscle fiber types here. So we have type 1, which is a little bit more oxidative. So this one's a little bit more fatigue resistant and typically takes a little bit more oxygen, right? So this one takes more oxygen, has higher resistance to fatigue, and produces less amount of force, but over a longer duration of time. So you might see this in like marathon runners, people who are trying to perform exercises at higher durations of time with lower force output required. Next up, what we'll see is type 2A, which is a fast twitch or oxidative fiber type. This is kind of that intermediate fiber type. So this fiber type typically has both anaerobic and aerobic properties present and are adapted to kind of the intermediate intensity and volume-based level of activity, right? So aspects where there's a moderate time frame and a moderate intensity, these type 2A fast twitch kind of oxidative fiber types are going to be more present or more predominant during that exercise. And then last but not least here, we have the fast twitch or the glycolytic fiber type, which is the type 2X. So if you think about a spectrum, kind of going from side to side, type 2-1 or type 1, type 2A, type 2X. Type 2X is going to be more of your fast twitch glycolytic, a little bit more anaerobic, meaning without oxygen. So these fiber types are a little bit more adapted to the short and higher intense levels of activity and are biased during those kind of exercises. So as we're kind of wrapping things up here, how do we actually train for RFD? So we've talked a lot about muscle, the contractions, and different fibers, the fiber types, orientations, all these kind of things that may contribute to it. How do we actually train it though? So when we're looking at training for rate of force development, it is very similar to how we would train for like power or high velocity based activities or exercises. So higher rates of force development can be described as like another neural adaptation as a byproduct from powerful exercises, ballistic movements, things where there's a higher stretch shortening cycle, and strength training in general. So we can strive for these adaptations by those movements. However, many, if not all, exercises have a progression and a regression in some form or fashion. So does that mean that we have to build up this high level of like strength and everything just to introduce some power? Not necessarily. We can always find an entry point at some level to help facilitate powerful exercises. So for instance, like we talked about last video where we talked about stretch shortening cycle, there's aspects to that, the three phases of the contraction, the eccentric, amortization, and concentric, right? There are ways that we can manipulate exercises so they're not as demanding on the body. So when we're training for rate of force development, we want to be able to adapt or have these neural adaptations of producing high levels of force quickly. However, all I'm trying to say here is that we don't always need a high prerequisite of strength, although it can be very beneficial. We don't always need that because there's ways that we can regress and progress activities in order to introduce those adaptations. So in general, conclusion, what are some big takeaways that we can take from this video? Powerful exercise like the Olympic weightlifting movements, anything that's fast requires there's certain adaptations that come with that, and this may influence the rates of force development that we can achieve by performing those exercises. Increasing our rate of force development can help reduce our risk of injury and falls by decreasing our reaction time and increasing our force output. So in general, like I think this was a pretty interesting topic to learn, to study a little bit more. And for those who are looking to be able to produce high levels of force more quickly and with less time and reduce the risk of injury in sport or anything else, it can be beneficial to start acknowledging the different physiological processes that go on behind the exercises and everything else. So these are just some of the references that I have with this video. If you guys have any questions, drop them in the comment section below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I did making it. I actually learned a lot from looking into this a little bit more as I have in my previous studies, but I appreciate you guys. If you guys made it to the end of this video, I appreciate you guys tuning in, and I hope you guys got something out of this as much as I did. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you guys, or look forward to making the next one. Thank you guys.